I do just think big telly people.
Big telly people.
Big telly people.
I don't know why.
Big telly people.
BTB.
Hello and welcome to this week's Life of the Party, a deep dive into everything to do with your party, the Green Party, a New Left Party, whichever party we all end up being a part of. I'm your host, Jonas Marvin, and I'm here with my friends and comrades, Shanice McBean.
Hello, hello.
And Todd.
Hello.
Thanks for all your support over the past few weeks. This podcast seems to be going from strength to strength, and it's in no small part because of your engagement. So keep that up. Drop us a comment with your thoughts on Spotify, Apple. Drop us an email with some questions and some ideas on podlifeoftheparty@gmail.com. We want to keep going from strength to strength, and we want to keep being a resource for people to discuss the ideas in our movement. So Shanice, what do you have for us on the news this week?
So there's been a lot of activity on both the Green side with the Green Surge and your party launching its assemblies and documents. So I'm going to talk about those two things. Let's start with the Greens. So the Greens are now the third biggest party in Britain. They're sitting neatly on 140,000 members, which is more than doubled since Zack Polanski became leader just over a month ago. So the Tory party are 123,000 members, Labour 309,000 and Reform 260. So the Greens have now really solidified themselves as a significant, major, mainstream political force in the UK. There's a couple of things to say about this. I won't go too much into it. Obviously, we're going to have a conversation, but I think the first thing is that there's a big challenge, I think, for Zack Polanski in this Green Surge. And the key challenge is going to be how he converts the enthusiasm that he has harnessed in terms of membership size and media performance into actual organising. You know, we've spoken about this on this podcast before, but one of the traps of Corbynism was having people who are fans of Corbyn but not socialist. And I think Zack Polanski has a double problem. He's got fans of Zack, but those fans need to become both socialists or at least, you know, politically educated, but also activists, because a lot of his recruitment has been off the back of, you know, people passively observing him in the media and on social media. And that's not a movement. And there's a risk, I think, of that kind of similarly with Corbynism, the cult of personality being a kind of stand-in for an actual organised movement. So that's what's happening on the Green side, this kind of huge surge and huge, I guess, popularity, mostly channeled through the mainstream media. On your party's side, it feels like your party is starting to really dig into the nitty-gritty of what is it going to become and what its identity is. Members and supporters were emailed just over a week ago now with news that the draft documents for the founding of your party had been released. So there were 4 sets of documents. There was the Constitution and the standing orders, the political statement, and the 1-year organisational strategy. And I mean, I'd be really interested to hear what you guys think, but off the back of it, it kind of looked like reading the documents a party that I actually wanted to be involved in. You know, I can't lie, I was really digging and searching for things that I could say maybe felt at odds with the notion of grassroots democracy or felt at odds with my political principles. And there's not really much that concerned me. There are some vagaries that I think we'll dig into. But overall, it looked pretty decent. So to get into some of the detail, conference is actually going to be binding on all political representatives and members, which I think was a real sticking point and an uncertainty, particularly around the Independent Alliance and kind of whether they would be able to, you know, advocate and platform political principles and values that were at odds with the political principles and values of your party. And at least in the draft documents, whatever's decided at conference is going to be binding on all political representatives. So that basically means, you know, if we pass and are able to pass trans rights policies or, you know, anti-landlord policies, for example, those will be binding on everyone, which I think is a real step forward. The proposal for the leadership team and the kind of structures of leadership are I think, fairly uncontroversial. So there'll be a central executive committee that will be made up of 16 ordinary members. And then in addition to that, there can be 2 members of parliament and then 2 regional political officers and representatives. The leadership team will be made up of 1 elected leader that will be elected based on 1 member, 1 vote. And they will kind of look after the political and strategic leadership of your party. And in the leadership team, they'll be joined by the chair of the Central Executive Committee and the deputy chair of the Central Executive Committee, and that will make up the leadership team. And I think the idea is that after 21 months or so, which will be the maximum term of the leader, the CEC, the Central Executive Committee, will then review kind of what those leadership structures look like moving forward. Branches will be linked to parliamentary constituencies, and if they're kind of big enough and maybe need to break up into more local groups, they'll be able to break up into wards. I think there'll be quite interesting debates around whether that's the right branch structure. But one thing that really stood out for me was the community organising units. And obviously this is a big debate under Corbynism as well, how we organise community organising versus electoralism. But it seems to me there's a big emphasis on organising grassroots working class power, and that kind of comes through in all of the Your Party documents. I know there is kind of like a burgeoning under the surface debate around affiliation and what that will look like. Within the Your Party documents, that's been parked to be looked at over the next 12 months. So there'll be, at least the proposal is that there'll be a robust consultative and process of debate where we'll be able to hash out whether things like trade unions and renters unions and community groups will be able to affiliate and kind of what the nature of that affiliation will look like. One thing that was a bit unclear to me is, so in the documents there was a bit on kind of organised sections, which I think is basically a euphemism for factions, caucuses, tendencies, etc. It's not clear to me at the moment whether what factions and tendencies and caucuses look like will be determined by the leadership, which I think will be really problematic, or whether they'll be able to kind of form more organically from the grassroots. And I think that's a little bit open at the moment. So that's thinking about the structural side. From the political side, I mean, the political statement was fine. I think it was a little bit vague. So it kind of settled the question on, is this going to be a socialist party or not? And it kind of said explicitly, this is going to be a socialist party. And it, used a few useful buzzwords like we've got a commitment to social justice, and we've got a commitment to international solidarity, to organising in workplaces. But it didn't come out explicitly for any particular social movement or struggle. So there wasn't a direct mention of anti-racism, anti-fascism, migration. There wasn't a direct mention of trans liberation or kind of feminism or anything like that. Where I was actually impressed, so where I wasn't just neutral, but was like, oh, actually, that's good, is what it said about internationalism and being anti-imperialist, being anti-colonization. And in fact, it said, quote, we're against the global system of imperial domination, colonization, and exploitation, and we support national liberation and self-determination. So I thought that was, a very explicit nod to the Palestine solidarity movement. Just to wrap up, I guess maybe points of tension. If you read the organizational strategy, so that's kind of, the kind of 1 year outlook on where your party wants to figure out where it goes. There was a lot of emphasis on kind of broad coalitions and not that much emphasis on what our political principles will be explicitly. And that, for me, raises concerns because obviously, one of the debates at the moment is on the left is, do we need to kind of soften our political principles in order to have this kind of broad appeal and pull in reform voters? So, do we need to not talk about racism and not talk about fascism so that we appeal to different sections of the working class? Or are we trying to put a line in the sand, say who we are, and try to build a mass organisation on that basis? And it felt to me like the Your Party documents were kind of gearing much more towards that we want to build broad, we want to build a majority mass organisation, which I agree with, but it didn't feel like there was a sense of that will be based on really strong political principles and values. And I think that also comes out with the kind of central focus that the Independent Alliance gets in the organizational strategy. They're kind of celebrated as being at the core of the founding of your party, which kind of solidifies them as a major player in a way, or at least attempts to. So yeah, those are just some initial thoughts, but I'd be interesting to hear what you guys think. What do you make of this? What's the lay of the land?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to get into with those documents. There's a ton. I think for me, like I'll just start with a note of humility in that I have been, working under the assumption, and probably still am to a certain extent, that there is a group of people around the top of the party who are intent on controlling it through different means. And I thought one of the means that they would try and control it was through these structure documents and potentially creating a party which is quite expressly anti-democratic. That hasn't happened. Like I think you can criticize these documents as being not particularly inspiring structurally. Maybe they haven't rethought the Labour Party in as radical ways as we'd have wanted them to. But you can't look at these documents and say, oh, this is just an absolute anti-democratic stitch-up, and it obviously is going to hand power to one faction or another. I just don't see that in these structures and in these documents, and that's just a good thing, and that's really, really, really good. I'm really heartened to see that. I suppose some of my criticisms or questions would revolve around, I think, the power balance between the CEC, so the Central Executive Committee, and the leadership. The CEC has 16 elected members. By my count, it could have up to 12 non-elected members if you include the members that come from the sections. And I think, Shanice, I read sections as like having trans LGBTQ sections and black sections and, specific minority groups represented on the CEC. That's how I read that in the documents. And I think you can have up to 12 non-electeds on the CEC. And, I was talking to a friend on Comrades, and he pointed out that does just create a dynamic where a minority of the elected members can build a majority with the non-elected members too. And we saw that on Labour's NEC under Jeremy's leadership, but also under other leaders. So I just think that there are opportunities for that which are bad. And I think if it were up to me, I'd have more of a directly elected CEC and fewer appointed positions. And then I think there's just the question with the leader. They talk about electing a leader and that leader having a certain amount of power, but there was not really much in there around staffing, for instance. Like, I assume a leader's office would have some staffing, but it's not really there. It does still read to me, though, that it won't be the case that it'll be governed from the Prime Minister's office or the leaders of the opposition office, and whatever that person says with regards to policy goes. It really didn't feel like that when we were reading it. And Shanice, I think you're right. Like it did seem like conference was sovereign. I think the last thing I'd say is that, and the bit where I wish there had been more imagination, was just around branches and branch structure. Because I think if you just have branches on a constituency level and you don't do things like, say, the Belgian Workers' Party do, where they have branches in workplaces as well as in geographies, for example, you just are very much restricting yourself to doing electorally focused organising, and you are building your structure around elections in that way. And obviously elections are really important, but I think it's a missed opportunity if we end up with just that kind of branch structure. I'd also, I think, like just to see more detail on branch structure too. There's really important questions about how big or how small branches are, whether the branches can set up working groups, what different ways people can get involved in branches, and how branches don't become bottlenecks when one local branch is not very well run, and it means that all the people in that area just can't get involved in the party's activity. So I'd love to see more detail on that. But hopefully this stuff can come through the assemblies and it can come through the conference in November.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to agree with you both, particularly on the point about your party and democracy. I mean, maybe I'm just like predisposed towards this way in terms of reading internal documents, but like they are pretty boring. And like
They're meant to be boring, though.
They're meant to be boring. I mean, maybe that tells us something.
This is the nerd stuff. Come on.
But they do seem like they point towards one fundamental question in any democracy, or any democratic organization, which how can you, the leader, be replaced? And I think that's really important. I kind of have a bit of like a sanguine perspective on things at the minute. Maybe that's my way of coping in terms of thinking about like longevity in the long term. Look, on the one hand, this is clearly all a bit of a missed opportunity, right? Like it's incredibly rushed. Because it's rushed, you end up trying to fit in big crowds into very small venues in a short period of time. So even if it isn't, which it is to some extent, it does still quite feel like it's a bit stage managed. I'm not clear from the documents about the relationship between deliberation and the regional assemblies and outcomes, frankly. Maybe you guys can help clear that up for me. That process, to me, how that's borne out is not totally clear to me. I think on the other hand, though, part of like me being a bit sanguine is that like, I just get the impression, and this is totally anecdotally, but like I get the impression that a lot of people are kind of just holding back a little bit, waiting in the wings. You can really feel it. And given the car crash at the launch, it's like kind of understandable that people just want to kind of see how the regional assemblies go, see how the conference goes, perhaps even see how the January to March period goes, where you decide things like the leader and all of that go, and then kind of make a calculation about to what extent they want to be engaged in this process, which given the car crash is totally reasonable. One of the things that's a bit confusing to me is I don't know why like this kind of founding process feels a bit separate and disjointed from the election of a leader from January to March. I might have misunderstood things there, but it just feels a bit disjointed to me. But I guess like one of the things for me in this moment is that like party membership is like deeply volatile, and that'll be the case for both parties. There's a question mark over to what extent you can turn those numbers into action, let alone to what extent you can turn those numbers into cadre, the kind of perennial problem of socialist politics. But obviously, Zack Polanski's leadership as the Greens set up for a far better start on that front than your party. I think like the question for your party is to what extent can the regional assemblies be seen as both repairing things a little bit, repairing the party's image, repairing some of the bonds in the organisation, but also kind of create a kind of intuition around like a meaningful, democratic and kind of strategically sound direction. And it's not solely, but it is in no small part up to the members. And there is some space, it seems, for members to make those decisions based on what we've seen from these initial documents and how we shape the assemblies, how we build branches over the next 6 months that make themselves relevant to people's lives. Obviously, it's fragile because the stupidity of incompetent politicians can jeopardize that. But like, it does seem like it's a bit of a possibility now. On like the community organizing thing, I think a community organizing unit would be good. Like, I think there's a danger, which is that like people hear community organizing unit and they think the Labour Party is community organizing unit. And, you know, fair enough for thinking that because it's basically run by the same people. But I think if it's conceptualized differently and it has like a different set of priorities and is wedded to a different kind of party, a community organizing unit that isn't just substituting for branches, but facilitating branches doing organizing work and thinks of the party as a totality, like in the way that like Joe just kind of alluded to in terms of giving branches the space to be organizers as well as electoral machines. I think that could be really important. On the kind of broader picture, I just think the moment in politics in a minute is so crisis ridden. It's so like, it feels like contingency is like baked into politics in a minute. And you know, on the one hand, when it comes to like Zack, for example, it's obvious that he's a couple of steps further along than your party is. And in some ways, the kind of benefit of posterity, that kind of feels like it was always going to be the case. But that question of how he converts that membership, how the Greens convert that membership into an active constituency, how he can pick fights that land, I think he's already doing quite a good job at that, actually. But crucially, how is he going to avoid the weaknesses of Corbynism in the face of an establishment onslaught? That remains to be seen, and it remains to be seen in a party with a history and with a tradition such as the Greens have. And I think that's going to be a challenge of which we haven't seen anything yet, basically.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Just before I comment on Zack and the Greens, I did forget to mention that the Your Party documents say that there will be mandatory reselection of political representatives, and for all political representatives that are elected, there'll be a 40% recall margin. So 40% of people in a local group want to recall an elected representative, they can do that. And I think those are great things and quite significant and kind of what everyone wanted. And yeah, Jonas, you know, I think this activist question and this question of how you organize and build a movement is going to be, I think, the fundamental strategic question for both the Greens and Your Party. I was at a Your Party Haringey launch event, and one of the main things I remember, not for positive reasons, is one person made a comment to Zara saying, when are you guys going to set up your party, because we need you to fight the fascists? And immediately I turned to my partner and I was like, hang on, we don't need Zara Sultana and Jeremy Corbyn to fight the fascists. We fight the fascists.
There's only two
fight
of
the
them.
fascists,
There's
guys.
only two.
Yeah. Just Jeremy Corbyn and Zara Sultana with like massive swords just like fighting off all these fascists and far right. And I think that is also reflected in, and this has been the second episode that I've mentioned him, but I am going to mention him again. Gary Stevenson, in his kind of take a break video, said, we've done a great job of building this movement this year that can really kind of take on the kind of political and media establishment. And I really took issue with his use of the word movement, because what he's done is built significant influence, but that isn't the same as power. Influence and persuasion isn't the same as activity and power and being able to actually confront the ruling class and win. So the Greens will have this issue at the local and branch level. They've got hundreds and in some places thousands of these new members coming in. Do they have the political infrastructure, the branch infrastructure, just basic onboarding infrastructure in order to absorb those new people and convert them from kind of passive observers of Zack in the media to organizers out in their local communities, confronting the state, confronting the political establishment? That's a huge task for Zack. They also have, a lack of money. I know Rachel Millward has been kind of talking about the need to kind of drive up funds, but most of their funds come through individual givers, which is great on the one hand because they're people powered and, they don't have their hands in the pockets of big donors and the political establishment in the way that the Labour Party, Tory Party and Reform do. But also, people are broke. People don't have that much money to give. And so there's a question there of, where do they get just the money from to kind of have the infrastructure to really convert the new kind of mass character of the Green Party into a significant organising force. And then, of course, your party will have those same issues too. And so while I do agree that there's some senses in which the Green Party are ahead of your party, there are some senses in which it isn't. Zack Polanski didn't go through Corbynism, doesn't have that experience, is a very new leader and is very new on the political scene in general and doesn't have that kind of movement memory. So how well he's going to be able to learn the lessons of Corbynism having not gone through it, and in some senses is, going through his own version of that period of Corbynism himself now, I guess some of that kind of remains to be seen.
He also doesn't have the baggage though. And I think that's really shown in the party at the moment through their proclivity towards unity. There was a Peter Walker piece in the Guardian about the Green Party today, and him and other lobby journalists have basically been assigned to go to Green Conference and try and find divides and find splits and find division in the party, and they couldn't find any. And even critics of Zack and people that don't agree with Zack's eco-populist approach are very complimentary and very supportive of him at the moment because he's doing well and they're going up in the polls. I think it's both like a cultural tendency towards unity, but also just a sense of excitement that actually they could become a mass party, and it's not crazy to think that in the next few years they could maybe supplant Labour as the default party of the left in the way that Reform is doing to the Tories. I think that's just creating an incredible amount of discipline, and that's good for them. That's like a good force.
They also booted out their transphobes, though. They did have that row.
Yeah, and it's very true. And they've already dealt with some of their tensions and some of their differences by essentially having one side win. I'd love to go back to this Jonas' sense of like people waiting in the wings. Like I think that it's definitely the case for your party, but I think it's also the case for the Green Party too. I was talking to my friend who was doing some phone banking for the Green Party the other day, calling through all of the new members, and a lot of people were like, yeah, I've joined, but I'm still not sure. And I think it's interesting how people join the party as the next step, but it doesn't mean that they're going to go from that to committing their entire lives to it, to giving a huge percentage of their income to it, to being seen as Green Party cadre through and through. And I think what maybe the membership numbers for the Greens hide is that there is still this sense of like, I'm actually not sure amongst a lot of the new members.
Yeah, I really agree with that. I think there's 2 points I want to make. Kind of the anecdote you have about that person speaking at the Your Party launch in Haringey, Shanice, like obviously it's kind of reflective of like, oh, the leaders will save us. It's kind of idolatry that was typical in Corbynism and speaks to a kind of weakness amongst the base. But I do also think that there is a kind of reality to it, which is that Reform isn't the traditional far right where you can physically oppose them on the street And so there's a kind of reflection there, both of like a social weakness, but also of a kind of, we do need a political wedge that would be reform. And obviously that creates a set of weaknesses within the movement and a set of dependencies that we've talked about a lot on this podcast. But I do think that is a real tension that the movement has to deal with. And the experience of Corbynism and learning from that and going through that learning process can be bad and it can be good, right? It like completely scarred people, and people who went through it didn't necessarily learn any lessons from it. Or if they did, they learned really unhealthy lessons from it.
Yeah, it's true.
Maybe we've seen a bit of that over the past few months. But there are people, I count us in this bracket of people who have learned good lessons from it. And I think there are lots of people at the base who have learned good lessons from it. As ever with these things, lessons need to be condensed and institutionalized and popularized. And I think that's some of the work that the left faces over the next period of time.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. And maybe to build on that and to continue going to bat for, you know, Zack and Gary and all of the big telly people. I do just think big telly people.
Big telly people.
Big telly people.
I don't know why.
Big telly people.
BTB.
I really think
Big
it's
telly
on
people.
this
Come on.
podcast.
Come on. There's a special place in my heart for the big telly people.
Oh, is there? I wonder why.
I don't know. I can't think what hidden meaning that comment has.
I'm not saying anything right now.
But look, like just to go to bat for the big telly people and building on Jonas's point about reform.
I'm
not
sorry,
being...
I can't take your point seriously.
This is definitely a bloopers thing.
I don't know, man. People love it when we laugh.
All right. I'm back in the zone.
But you know, like if we're accepting that you can't take on reform on the streets in the same way that, you know, you do with now UKIP and, you know, the BNP before them and the EDL and all of that, and that you need to have an electoral wedge to beat them, there are different realms in which you need to beat them. Obviously, you need to be more organised on the ground in terms of turning out votes. You need to be more organised in communities by actually providing social space and doing organising and having a visible local pole of attraction that is of the left. But you also do need to be winning the battle on the internet, on social media, and in TV studios as well, especially in a context where more people spend more time at home on their phones experiencing other people in this like dislocated and mediatized way. So I think that's just my case for the big telly people being part of the movement.
No, they should obviously be part of the movement. Come on. But it's more like you can't see that as the end of the road. Like it's not
100%.
just enough to persuade people. Once you've persuaded them, you need to get them to do something, right?
100%.
Okay, thanks for that, guys. That was a great conversation. So, Joe, what's the hot take this week?
I almost don't want to make this hot take, but because everyone's going to disagree with me. But I'm going to do it. Okay, so I'm making these arguments, hopefully, with a lot of delicacy and nuance. Interpreted the wrong way, but I do think that the new party, whether it is the Greens or your party, needs to be more than the Palestine party, and I'll talk about why. So I do think we need to look at where we're at in the British left, and we need to look where we're at with your party and the Green Party, and we need to be really clear that there is an increasingly productive and powerful coalition being built between Muslim communities who, for understandable reasons, really care about Palestine, and the urban graduate fraction of the working class who are highly motivated around this issue, read a lot of news, and to be honest, I've had quite like an intense experience of the genocide because of the way that it's been live streamed and the way that we've just consumed content day after day after day. And this coalition, which was not always guaranteed, like you think back 5, 10, 15 years ago, the right were trying to drive wedges between these two groups of people around, say, LGBT issues in schools and stuff. So it was, you know, this is never a guaranteed thing. It's now this really powerful component of our base, which saw increased Muslim representation within the Green Party, the Independent Alliance MPs get elected. And, you know, Jeremy Corbyn as a figure just kind of like perfectly encapsulates this, because he's always been known for, and in many ways been defined by his anti-imperialist politics, most notably with Palestine. So I think that's like really, really important to recognize, and we wouldn't want to understate the impact of the pro-Palestine movement in the UK and its history. I also think that it has become one of the defining moral issues of our time in the way that the anti-apartheid movement was maybe to our parents. It has just become this clarifying thing where if you can't say that the genocide is wrong and the genocide should not happen and the genocide is this like abominable thing that's going on, then kind of where do you even sit, not as a political agent but as a person? You know, what kind of integrity do you have left, frankly, if you can't say that? So I think those two things are really true, that it composes a huge part of our base, and it is this like defining moral issue, which is really helpful for our politicians, be it Zack or be it Jeremy or Zara, to give them this kind of like moral clarity to soar above the fray in a way. But but I think it's essential for your party or the Green Party to become mass parties of the working class that connect with parts of the working class that sit outside of these two factions. And I think to do that, we will just have to go beyond Palestine as an issue. And this doesn't mean that we're not going to set up an anti-Zionist party. This doesn't mean that we're not going to say we're anti-imperialist. This doesn't mean that we're going to change our position on Palestine. Zohar Mamdani showed that you don't have to do any of those things. But it means in quite concrete ways, when we're campaigning and we're organizing, we have to look to issues where people already have a lived and often material engagement with. You know, I was looking at some of the polling this morning. It's quite hard to find polling specifically on how highly people rate Palestine as an issue that matters to them over time. But I found one poll from 2025. Only 7% of the population included Gaza as a top three issue. Only 15% of people who are considering voting for the Greens had it as a top three issue. So only 15% of potential Green voters had it. For the Greens, the top issues were cost of living, the NHS, and the climate, although interestingly, the climate only just got in there. And for most people, it's been cost of living, the NHS, and then migration, with migration going up over the last few years and the cost of living going down and then going up a little bit more. And, you know, like you can be skeptical of polling, and I'm skeptical of polling, and I don't base all my politics or my strategy on it, but there isn't any polling really that shows that Gaza in particular is an issue that is of meaningful importance to a vast swathe of the working class in the UK on a day-to-day basis. And I think this is interestingly shown by the last election, in that if you talk to some of the people who were behind the independent alliance MPs, and one of the things that they'll say is actually on the ground, they didn't campaign on Gaza a lot as a specific issue. They didn't go door to door and say, if you think what's happening in Gaza is really bad, you should vote for us. They campaigned on the cost of living, they campaigned on the NHS, they campaigned on these material issues. Now, obviously, it was really important that they had the right position on the genocide, and the people that voted for them probably wouldn't have voted for them if they didn't. But they weren't the issues that they were putting front and center. And I think this is important in an electoral sense. I think this is also important for our organizing too. Like we want a party to go out and build community infrastructure. We want it to organize in communities. We want it to bring people in through building collective power and putting people through collective struggle. I think the things that we should be focusing on as a party should be organizing a community infrastructure that speaks to the needs that people have and the things that people have at the top of their mind already. And as far as I can tell from all of the polling, that's not Gaza. And I'll finish on this. I think it's a question of kind of moral clarity versus strategic necessity, in that I think we have to have the moral clarity on Gaza and what's happening there. Like we have to. It's completely essential for us to, you know, ensure that everyone we already have in our project is going to really dedicate themselves to the project. And it's essential just as basic moral orientation. But we have to look at what is strategically necessary to bring new people in, build working class power, and win both on an organizing and electoral level. And for me, it just has to be going to people on the issues that matter to them day to day.
I guess I'll jump in there with just some minor points. I have some more significant points, but one minor point is I don't even think there's a sense in which your party can even claim to be the Palestine party, given that the Palestine Solidarity Movement is a movement of hundreds of thousands of people, and your party is not a party of hundreds of thousands of people. So the sense in which that the sense in which that coalition is actually reflected in the current membership of your party is a moot point anyway. And the second one, this is a bit of a minor point, but I guess maybe reflects a difference in how we approach politics, Joe, is there's no part of me that is a pragmatist. I'm barely a strategist. I'm very much a theorist. And that is because I guess maybe the one thing that I define myself as even more than being a Marxist is being a revolutionary. And so my vision is always on where I want to end up. Sometimes I can pay less attention to how we get there. But when we think about like how we make arguments that persuade people, part of that job is not just appealing to where people are, but I think a socialist party specifically has to kind of transform the political landscape more broadly. So, I think there are really interesting and powerful arguments that you can make here around how Palestine does really connect to people's day-to-day lived reality that maybe aren't so obvious, but that's the argument that we have to make to convince and persuade people that these things matter at a fundamental level. One of the big ones is repression. A lot of the repressive measures that the state are bringing in to crack down on protests, to infiltrate into your lives, into your home, your mobile devices, your online presence. A lot of that is being justified and facilitated through a crackdown on Palestine solidarity. And I think that's an obvious route into the argument because so many people are feeling that repression on the day-to-day on the left and right. And then there's also just, a basic argument of contrast. Why on earth was the government committed to spending potentially millions facilitating racist Israeli football hooligans on the streets of Birmingham versus investing millions in the kind of living standards and, hopes and dreams of the people in their own country? And I think that raises fundamental questions on, why is it that the West are so in lockstep with Israel, a foreign country? What is it about the global capitalist system and global imperialist systems that then ricochet back onto the domestic UK population in that way? So for me, those are quite, material ways that we can make the argument alongside, a case for we need kind of economic renewal in this country and, we need to be fighting for people's day-to-day living standards.
Yeah, I want to take a couple of steps back, and I want to take a couple of steps back to a guy called Karl Marx. And I think this is important because Karl Marx wrote a lot about Ireland when he was around, particularly in the later part of his life, when he was kind of radicalizing and he was taking the question of anti-colonialism much more seriously. And he has this line in a letter to a compatriot at the time where he talks about Ireland being behind the impotence of the English worker. He talks about how the kind of resentment, the competition, the racism of the English worker contributes towards the English worker's own weaknesses. And he talks about how the English worker also has an interest in freeing Ireland so that he can free himself and weaken the power of the British state and British imperialism. Now, I want to both agree with that in some ways and trouble that in some ways. Palestine is a kind of is not just a kind of issue of moral clarity that we've all been involved in organizing it. I've been organizing for Palestine since I was a teenager. It was the first demonstration I ever went on. It's like the heart of my politics. But Palestine also functions as the kind of racialized terrain of crisis in this current moment. For example, when we think about the pogroms in 2024, the pogroms were a response to the fact that you'd had a year and a half of multiracial crowds taken to the streets in support of Palestine. And it's no coincidence then that when you go on the anti-fascist demonstrations that were organizing in communities just like Stoke against the pogroms, the flag that you saw most prominent on those demonstrations wasn't the kind of 1936 International Brigade's flag. It wasn't a stand up to racism flag. It was a Palestinian flag. I think that's really important because I think we have to think about both of the points that you're raising as a bit more integrated. And we have to think about how Palestine has often become the syntax, the language through which crisis manifests and through which politics unravels. And I think we have to take that seriously. But I also think we have to think a bit about like the kind of composition of the Palestine solidarity movement a bit. Shanice alluded to some of this. So on the one hand, it's one of the largest movements in the history of Britain. It's one of the most working class movements in the history of the country. And it's certainly one of the most multiracial movements in the history of the country. And Palestine, even though for me, I've always had kind of a hard line of Palestine, I think for some sections of the left, particularly during Corbynism, Palestine felt like a cross to bear. And so whilst for me, Palestine is central, and I think one of the basic responsibilities of the British left in a kind of state that's central to the creation and durability of Israel's existence is that we bear that cross and we organize for Palestine. We have Palestine at the center of our politics. But I want to caveat that a bit, because I don't actually think Palestine is the cross to bear that a lot of people on the left think it is. I'm not saying you're saying this, Joe, but I think this is the case for people on the left. And I certainly don't think it's the cross to bear that it was deemed as under Corbynism when it became the syntax through which the crisis of Corbynism was articulated. Partly because, yes, it's not high up on the list of people's priorities in the country when you really ground into it, but it is something that's been at the foreground and the forecenter of a kind of countercultural implosion in this country. Maybe it's typical to talk about Glastonbury, but it's not just Glastonbury, right? And Bob Vylan, but it's also Kneecap. It's the kind of intuitive sense of BDS in a lot of places up and down the country at the minute. It's the kind of majoritarian support for banning arms sales to Israel. And I think that sort of stuff should be taken seriously, because I think one of the things that's really important about a mass left is its ability to tap into the counterculture. And you can only do that with complete honesty. And so like when I say that Palestine isn't necessarily a cross to bear, that's also to imply that I think we should be bolder about Palestine. Mamdani has shifted his position to win the election, as you and me had talked about in the past, Joe. And, maybe there's a kind of story where that was necessary. Maybe we can talk about that. But frankly, I think his original position, really subtle, that no state based on the intrinsic institutional supremacy of one faith, people, a race over another has a right to exist. And realistically, that means that the settler colonial state in no iteration feasibly possible has a right to preserve itself. I think that's a position that we should embrace in this country, where the Overton window
100%.
has moved. Because look, we're always quite keen to talk about this on the podcast, but politics isn't static. Before Corbynism, 250,000 people took out to the streets to march for Palestine in 2014. 3 years later, it felt like there wasn't really a Palestine solidarity movement at any scale because of the level of attacks within the Labour Party and the level of the movement from the social movements into Corbynism. I don't think we can afford that again. I don't think we can afford to make those mistakes again. So, of course, we have to build those stories and organising over the stuff that immediately faces people, whether that's wages, food prices, landlord power. But Palestine is an election winner in some places and should be seen as part of that chain of signification that we've talked about. Wages, food prices, landlord power, solidarity with Palestine would be really popular if a councillor ran on that basis in my ward, such as the composition and the kind of political history. But there's another bit here, which is I think the left should be about, I'm not a maximalist by any stretch. I might sound like one after all of that. But I think the left should be about pushing the boundaries of sentiment and not simply hitting its limit. I don't know if either of you read the New Yorker piece on Mamdani a few weeks ago. I thought there was a really interesting bit about it, a really interesting insight. And it was with a former aide to Obama. And he talks about Mamdani's campaign in these terms. He says, none of this works without him speaking up on Gaza. For average people on the ground having conversations in their barbecues or on their stoops, there's a way that the issue of Gaza is a gateway to whether or not you can invite this political figure into your living room for a conversation about affordability or education or healthcare. You don't get to first base on the other things if you haven't come out of the batter's box on Gaza. I guess what I'm saying is that we have to think about the relationship between domestic politics and internationalist politics as a bit more synthesized and interrelated, because the other side do.
Look, I big, fat, massive agree with you both in terms of no triangulation on Palestine with regards to our position. The fact that actually supposedly radical positions on Palestine could be incredibly popular with the public. I mean, I think we've seen examples where, Jeremy, after the Manchester terror attacks during was it 2017 election, when he came out and said that this stuff happens because of foreign wars, the media class went absolutely crazy. But it turned out that his position was really very popular amongst the public. I think there is that deep sense of why are we spending all of this money on foreign wars, and why are we sending people to die in these places, and why are we causing death and destruction in this completely needless way? So I completely agree with that. And I think if we were to all articulate the positions that we'd want the party to take on Palestine, or what should be written about Palestine in its founding political documents, I think we'd really struggle to disagree. You know, like I'm really with you with that. It's more that I'm just obsessed with this question of how do we build enough social and electoral power to actually take on capitalism, transition to socialism. And I just think if you're going to take this question seriously, you have to end up being a bit of a strategist at some point. And it kind of means that you have to end up thinking about almost like the economics of political argument and how much time you're going to spend on different issues and how much salience you're going to give different issues in different places and in different ways. Really, I'm kind of coming from a very traditional community organizing perspective in a sense. The traditional Acorn thing was you go into people's communities without an agenda and you go and talk to people, and the stuff that they talk to you about is the stuff that you campaign on and you center in your program or in your communications. And I'm kind of just coming from there. Like if we go into constituencies and it turns out that Palestine is a deeply motivating issue, which we're able to do a ton of like amazing organizing around and also win an election on, we should 100% obviously campaign on Palestine in that place. For sure. But that's kind of the baseline that I'm coming from. And I think just one other thing on the left-wing political parties don't just exist to triangulate around a supposedly static electorate and then win. They exist to change the minds of the electorate by making arguments. That I completely agree with. It's just the question is to what extent? Like that's the $1 million question there, is to what extent? Because obviously we can imagine a left-wing party which made all of the arguments that we'd want all of the time at a really, really like high profile level, say for open borders, prison abolition, all of this stuff. And it would maybe be quite successful in changing people's opinions and changing the Overton window, but it might be quite unsuccessful at getting anybody elected. And if you look at Zack Polanski, for instance, Zack's not doing that. That's taking a middle approach where he has a certain amount of principled issues that he's not going to move on: migration, Palestine, and then he focuses on popular material issues. And I'm not saying like where Zack's landed is the place, but it's always this question with going to where people are at already and trying to change their minds is to what extent, you know?
Yeah, I guess, and this is maybe where I have an issue with the Green Party and Zack Polanski, which is that if we're going to have socialism, that's not just going to require a mass majoritarian politics. It's also going to require us to take on capital, and if we take on capital, we're taking on imperialism and we're taking on Western domination as well. And those then make the domestic question an international question as well. And I guess, part of my problem with how Zack Polanski and the Green Party approaches the question of Palestine and then to extension NATO and imperialism is it's very moralistic, but it's not got systemic analysis. So, for example, the Greens and Zack's position on NATO is that NATO in the long term is not great because we want to move towards diplomacy and pacifism, and nuclear deterrence are bad. I agree with those things. But in that, there's no systemic analysis of the role that NATO, for example, plays in Western domination across the world and in Palestine and NATO countries. There's no analysis of the role that Palestine plays in propping up Western capitalism in the region. There's no analysis of Israel as the protector of Western capitalist interests in the Middle East. And then there's no analysis of how all of those things connect to the climate. For example, the genocide in Gaza and in Palestine isn't just a genocide, it's also an ecocide. Been hundreds of thousands of tons of CO2 pumped into the atmosphere from the genocide in Gaza. In 120-day period, the same amount of CO2 as 26 countries output annually was pumped into the atmosphere. The soil in Gaza has been destroyed, the water wells have been destroyed, agriculture has been destroyed. So all of these things are then connected. And, I think there's a historic opportunity here, again, with your party being founded in the moment where we've got Palestine solidarity and internationalism and anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism penetrating the kind of cultural sphere in the UK and in politics on the left. There's a historic opportunity for a solidly anti-imperialist party. And this is maybe where Zara Sultana was right, that we need to create that anti-imperialist party but she's wrong to use the question of NATO as a political football, because it then just becomes this idea of, well, how do we differentiate ourselves from the Green Party, as opposed to us having a solid analysis of anti-imperialism, settler colonialism, capitalist domination, and therefore what the policy of your party around that should be.
Yeah, really sympathetic to that. I want to talk from my own experience a little bit here, actually. I've talked about Palestine's always been kind of central to my organizing, but from kind of 2023 and the beginning of the genocide and then the kind of the start of the mass movement to April this year, Palestine was basically all I did organizing wise. And, you know, I eventually kind of got burnt out and had to take a step back from things. And then took a couple of months out and then kind of made the decision to kind of get involved in your party stuff locally. But that there was a political calculation that underlaid that, like if I'm being totally frank, which is I felt that like the Palestine solidarity movement had hit a bit of the limit in the country. It was one of the most profoundly inspiring mass movements in the history of this country, but it had hit a kind of power limit. And that had kind of, it reflected tensions within the movement, you know, just like those MPs who are now in your party reflect a kind of truth that the Palestine solidarity movement also reflected a kind of cross-class movement. It wasn't simply working class, even if it was working class majority, but there were also other tensions that existed around charity and mobilization on the one hand versus organizing and solidarity and thinking about power on the other. And I came to the conclusion, and this was part of my burnout, and this I think will chime with you, Joe, which is that we do need a national left majoritarian project. And we need to take that seriously. And that was kind of my part of my calculation after being burnt out about moving on to your party stuff. But that wage is kind of worth nothing if Palestine isn't at the core of that kind of transition and activism. And I think this speaks to a kind of wider issue here that the left has, which is that when we have to see things as a generational project, I think maybe some of us disagree about this, but I don't think the left's going to be in office, let alone in power for a while. And that feels daunting given the timeline of the climate crisis and the escalating threat of the far right and the feasibility of a reform-led government. But I think we have to think, a friend always reminds me who's writing about this, I think we have to think about these kind of tensions between a left majoritarianism and a kind of Marxist-adjacent minoritarianism. And I think like the task of mass politics is how, you know, to quote you, Joe, how you do a kind of communist madman and straddle the two in a way that resonates.
I don't think I ever used that phrase. I would never say something as crazy. I would never say something as crazy as communist madman.
And I think that's plagued projects on the left, right? Like historically that's plagued projects on the left. If we go back to 20th century social democracy and the kind of birth of communism after the First World War, that's a response to the fact that social democracy aligns itself with imperialism. These aren't new questions, right? But it's also central to how we are undone. And that's why we have to be both principled, but also supple about how we communicate things. Because Corbynism handled it horrifically. They handled the whole affair horrifically. The voices of Palestinians were completely crowded out. I think lots of concessions were made on the question of Palestine. Corbyn, to his credit, was one of the few people who didn't make many concessions and was kind of the last fighting in the corner on his own. But also all of the messaging and the kind of talking about anti-Semitism was completely back to front from the whole project. And the reason I worry about this is because I worry that these same problems will afflict the Greens and will afflict Zack Polanski, because I think some of these problems are heightened in already existing institutional parties of the left, where you already bring institutional baggage, political frameworks with connections to liberalism. You know, these are all of the things that confronted Corbynism, right? And their success often isn't about the internal struggle, because Zack's in a really good position in the Greens internally, but they are about how internal disputes resonate with moral panics that happen outside of the party. You know, for example, from 2015 to 2017, even though Corbynism was rudderless and it was a bit all over the place, and there was the chicken coup, they couldn't get rid of him. He could still stand in that 2017 election and do really well. But it's funny how from 2017 to 2019, we're on the question of both Brexit, where you had mass protests for Remain, and on the anti-Semitism crisis, where it kind of spoke to a real feeling amongst the Jewish community in the country, even if I disagree with that. There was a kind of interrelationship between a mass mobilization of the center and of the right and the internal thing. Whereas from 2015 to 2017, you didn't necessarily have that in the same way. And that kind of brings in the tension of how you balance left majoritarianism and Marxist adjacent minoritarianism. Because I think we can flip too much either pole sometimes. You know, we have a social movement and we're all on the kind of Marxist adjacent minoritarian wing when the social movement happens. And then the prospect for a national electoral machine happens and we all do left majoritarianism. And
Yeah.
I think we have to balance the two.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
I think we have to find a way to do transitional politics. You know, Trotsky talked about transitional demands. Andre Gores talked about non-reformist reforms. We have to think of new categories for doing these kinds of things. And we have to think about them explicitly on the kind of terrain on comms and left strategy as well, which I think is partly what you're alluding to, Joe. And I think part of this is why I'm a big fan of listener exercises and just general outreach and things about going to working class people and talking to working class people about the issues that they face, is because you're not going to get a good sense of that balance between maximalism and minimalism until you have a meaningful organic connection with a big enough group of people. So principles, yes, but like the principles have to be tight, but also subtly communicated.
100%. And I'd say it's not just communications, it's communications and organizing. It's the sense of like what issues do we put our time and energies into? And this is a Belgian Workers' Party phrasing, right? You have a principal Marxist party that has, as Shanice was alluding to, that the Green Party don't, this sophisticated and structural explanation for why these things are happening and how they're interrelated, paired with a supple set of tactics that respond to and are in dialogue with where the class are at
Yeah.
a certain time. Like that is, for me, that is what I'm just trying to emphasize with this. And I'm trying to zoom in on the specifics of the suppleness, not a phrase I ever thought I'd say. I'm trying to zoom in on the specifics, you know, and push some focus to that, because I really agree with you, Shanice, on the moralism point around how Zack talks about some of these issues. It's like, I have this position because it's right, you
Yeah.
know, and there's a real limitation to that in terms of political education. I think there's also a real limitation to that in terms of trying to persuade certain more disengaged working class people that you should engage with this kind of politics. There's really some really interesting work done around how to talk about reform recently, and they said, look, it's no good just saying that reform are rich or Nigel Farage is posh or whatever. What you have to do is you have to link specifically what Farage is saying, his demonization of migrants and his emphasis on migration, with the fact that he is super wealthy, backed by these big corporations, and it is good for these big corporations to divide you with these people, because then it means you're not looking at them. And if you have a structural explanation as to why it's happening, it's actually far more persuasive.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think one thing that I want to bring into the conversation that really frustrates me about Zack, and this Zack is genuinely getting wrong, is this soft patriotism that he's trying to push, which I think, you know, is emblematic of what happens when you try to appeal to an electorate without a proper systemic analysis. He's pushing this idea of, Nigel Farage isn't really patriotic because a real patriot loves their neighbour, and a real British patriot can be of any race, and a real British patriot would be against the billionaires and against the exploiters. And I think there's just a real problem with idealizing this notion of the nation as a central kind of political category. Number one, it appeals to and legitimizes already existing racial and national anxieties and hierarchies in the country. You know, it legitimizes this idea that there is an in-group, the Brits, the Nationals, and an out-group. Just accept, we're going to allow some brown people who have been here for long enough or eat our food or live in our communities, we're going to allow them into the in-group. But this is a massive problem. For example, recent arrivals. Are they allowed into the in-group of being British if they arrive here and don't speak the language or aren't embedded in the culture, or, don't have the history of 2 or 3 generations of migration behind them? And yeah, I just have a massive problem with that, because fundamentally migrants are here because Britain was there. There's that famous quote, "We are here because you were there." And that is a much better, I think, argument to make, that, migration happens and because the West is going around the world fiddling with other people's countries, extracting their resources, creating a global poor that then looks elsewhere for a better life. That is a much better argument, the argument of universal humanity. People should be able to come here because they're human beings and human beings deserve good lives, rather than we need to love our neighbours because our neighbours have been here long enough, and it doesn't matter if they're black or brown, they're part of the nation as well. And I think that is one place where Zack is getting it wrong. We don't need to appeal to this idea of patriotism. We can instead appeal to the idea of humanity, just like basic, uncontested humanness.
And what you say plays out in the polls, right? I mean, you see people who are anti-recent migrant but pro people who have been here a long time. So you 100% see that division. I think the only thing I'd say to it is just to come back to that thing of how much is it the job of the left party to try and transform how people think about themselves and their place in the world, and whether that's as part of a nation state or as part of a set of people across a whole planet. And how much is it the job of that party to engage with where people are at now to try and build and gain power in various ways? Like, I agree with your critiques of Zack. I think they're completely correct. I have no response to your analysis. But someone who's running Zack's electoral strategy may say that, well, people conceive of themselves as part of a nation. We're trying to build a project where we're trying to run the government of a nation. So it's hard not to talk in terms of the nation. And it's, you know what I mean? So it's that tension between maybe theory and strategy, like you said earlier.
But also identity, right? And I really like to look back to moments in British history where the working class weren't so attached to the idea of the British nation, which is a bourgeois ruling class concept to begin with, and were much more attached to kind of local identities, class identities, or kind of recent migration and kind of social identities that came with that. And I think there's no inevitability to nation as the organizing principle in the working class. And I guess from an electoral perspective, I can see why it's not the number one issue. But from a socialist perspective, trying to create a socialist society, trying to break down those divisions in the working class and trying to create, the international global conditions where a socialist society can actually work and thrive, these questions become much more salient.
Yeah, the nation is a kind of institutional form of modernity, right, and of political contestation. And that's the kind of nub underlying the question and the kind of dramas of left majoritarianism, where the project is to conquer the nation state.
Exactly.
It's to win an election. It's to control armies, borders, police forces. And that poses all of these questions to left majoritarianism that I really can't wait, actually, as we have this conversation, to tease out a bit more on the podcast, because the stakes are currently so low in terms of like where the left is at. Do you know what I mean? So like teasing these out when the stakes are a bit higher is going to be really fun and important. But I would just say this: sometimes some of this stuff feels a bit confected, like just a little bit twee and a little bit smart by two half. And Zack talks about kinds of progressive patriotism. Like, I get it. I get where it's coming from, but it just feels a bit needless, particularly at this stage of where the left is at. And personally, I would just refrain from it, because we're not very good at that stuff on the left, actually, mostly because we don't believe it. So we shouldn't really try it.
Yeah. Okay, so I guess maybe a final point from me, and this is just circling back to what you spoke about in your hot take, Joe, is this idea of the Palestine movement representing this coalition between the left and Muslim voters and political agents in the UK. And I guess we can't talk about that without talking about some of the conclusions that people on the left are coming to around what that means for us politically, particularly this idea. And we did dig into it in episode 2, I think. But the conclusion that some people are coming to is that this coalition therefore means we need to be socially conservative in our politics. And I just wanted to take the opportunity to kind of shout out the Trans Liberation Group that has formed in your party. I guess you can call it a caucus or whatever. But I guess their whole point of forming is to kind of make the political case for trans liberation in your party around the fact that trans people are, lambasted in the media, don't get access to good healthcare, jobs don't pay trans people very well. Trans people have disproportionate levels of homelessness and insecure housing and, these real material issues. But at the same time as that being the reality, there are some arguing that, well, we shouldn't take these issues on because we need to keep this coalition together, this demographic coalition between the left and Muslims, and therefore we need to appeal to social conservatism. And I guess I just want to challenge that just by pointing out that I think Marvin Ali, now he's been elected, I think has put a nail in the coffin to the idea that in order to appeal to Muslims, Muslim voters, you have to be anti-trans, you have to be anti-LGBT, you have to be anti-feminism. Joe, you spoke about last episode the fact that there was like a Muslim contingent at the Green Party conference around Marvin Ali. And since he's been elected, he's been very clear on where he stands on these issues. You know, he's pro-trans liberation, he's pro-LGBT rights, he's pro-women's rights. He's not come out with any of the anti-trans dog whistle that Adnan Hussein has. And he stands shoulder to shoulder with Zack Polanski, who's an openly gay Jewish man. So yeah, I just wanted to just bring that into the space to say, I think we need to kind of rubbish this idea that social conservatism is how we keep this coalition together, and that actually the Green Party, in one sense, provide, I guess, a real good example of how you can do that.
Yeah, completely. And I think it's a really good point to end on, because it brings us back to maybe the question that a lot of what I've said is orbiting around, which is issue salience. Like it's, it may well be the case that if you polled them, there would be differences with regards to the mean opinion within the Muslim community who are very pro-Palestine and, say, urban graduates who are very pro-Palestine on some social issues. Like that may well be the case. I don't know. But does it matter that much if those issues aren't the salient issues at the time and they're not issues that you're building the coalition around? I would say no. And I just think you can't go about doing this thing of being like, well, we want to appeal to this group of people, but our base think this thing, so we're going to basically tell our base that they're wrong and they're idiots and they need to shut up to appeal to this like other imaginary group of people out there. It's precisely what the Labour Party do to its own membership, and look how that's gone. So it's just like, you know what I mean? I mean, there's this communications person called Anat Asarya-Shenker, and she just has this very basic formulation, which is you try and come up with positions which appeal to your base and energize them, and also persuade the middle but piss off your opponents. Like that's roughly the formulation that you're looking for. And the idea that any new party is going to triangulate on social issues with the current composition of the British left is just like mad, to be honest. And Zach's shown that like it's, yeah, like you obviously don't do that.
But also Marvin Ali, he's made a really good point, which is that who is being used as a scapegoat by the political and ruling class at the moment? It's migrants, it's Muslims, and it's trans people. And that is a basis of unity that doesn't require either of those groups to sell any of the others out, even if they don't agree on absolutely everything. And I think even when those issues do become more salient, that is a really powerful argument for, look, we might not agree on each other's lifestyles. I'm not a Muslim, so clearly that means, I don't live as a Muslim, I'm not Muslim, so it's not my belief system. But I will always stand shoulder to shoulder with a Muslim when we're fighting against the same enemy. And I think that's what Marvin Ali is saying. He will always stand shoulder to shoulder with his trans colleagues when we are fighting the same enemy, and fighting for his trans colleagues as well. And I think that's key.
And finally, to round out and say goodbye, what should everyone else be reading or listening to this week? Shanice.
So my one has to be Resisting Erasure, Capital, Imperialism and Race in Palestine by Adam Haniya, Robert Knox and Rafif Ziada. And that is just a little pamphlet by Verso. And it's just really good at just cutting through the noise on Palestine and really understanding why the genocide has happened, why this time, and why countries like the UK, Germany, the US are just in lockstep supporting a genocidal settler colony. So if you really want to understand the why behind it, read Resisting Erasure.
Joe?
Yeah, so I've been very slowly reading this book for a long time, but it's getting good. It's a book called Burnout, The Emotional Experience of Political Defeat by Hannah Proctor. It came out, I think, this year or last year. And it tries to tackle a longer look at what emotional effects it has on people, activists, organisers, when you lose and when you drop out of activity, when you become one of those people that aren't visible anymore, but you go off the political radar and kind of what happens to you. And there's some wonderful interviews from women who lived in pit villages during the miners' strike, and kind of like the sense of unity and purpose that the struggle gave them, and how they dealt with that afterwards. And it's just a very good antidote, I think, to a lot of the dominant emotional affect of, say, Corbynism, which was always just one more push, and like, you know what I mean, just like all in comrades, one more push, and it's just it's like very delicate and sophisticated, and yeah, it's a really, really good book.
Awesome. I'm just about to finish one of the best books I've read this year, I think, and it's called Dilla Time by a guy called Dan Charnas. It's about Jay Dilla, who was a Detroit hip hop producer who basically completely transformed music. He kind of disrupted the sort of swing time and straight times of music that we're all quite used to, and created a kind of new time feel, which puts different parts of the drum pattern in tension with others. And as well as a kind of moving biography, it's also a story about like the relationship between race and deindustrialization and new forms of culture. It was really kind of sad reading it, to be honest with you, because about halfway through reading it, D'Angelo, simply one of the best musicians in the world, passed away. And the book felt even more moving, especially because they were both part of this kind of quote unquote neo-soul movement, the Soulquarians. And like Jay Dilla was kind of seen as the kind of lodestar, something of a musical god to a lot of these people. Like if you've ever listened to D'Angelo's Voodoo, which is just one of the best albums ever, that's almost a call and response to kind of Dilla's musical innovations, but in the form of live instrumentation. That's what the project's trying to do. So that was, it's a wonderful book. Check it out. It's called Dilla Time. And if you ever get a chance, listen to Donuts by Jay Dilla and Voodoo by D'Angelo, because they're both amazing. And RIP to both of them. That's it until next time. We'll include all those links in the show notes, but in the meantime, find us on Instagram at life.oftheparty and Twitter on Life of Party Pod. Leave your comments at Apple, Spotify, and all the rest, and let us know what you think.